Very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us today for our launch event for our joint thematic inspection of MAPPA arrangements in England and Wales, which was published yesterday morning alongside an effective practice guide. Great to see so many of you in the audience. We've got a very wide range of organisations represented, including police, probation, NHS, children's services, and a range of people from academic backgrounds as well. Which shows, I think, the very wide interest that there is in this particular topic. Over the next half an hour or so, we're going to talk you through the key findings from our inspection. You'll be hearing from Noreen Wallace, who was the lead inspector for the team of inspectors for this piece of work. You'll also hear from Dr. Sarah Lewis from Penal Reform Solutions, an organisation which, on our behalf, interviewed people on probation about their experiences in MAPPA supervision. And finally, you'll be hearing from Tammie Burroughs, who's our head of effective practice, around some of the excellent practice we found in some areas around MAPPA arrangements. Also in the audience are Sandra Fieldhouse from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons and Mel Bowden from HMIC FRS, who also participated in the study. Next slide. Many of you will already be very well aware of the background context for MAPPA, but for those of you who aren't, the legislative basis for MAPPA dates back to the Criminal Justice Act 2003, which placed a statutory obligation on every criminal justice area to establish MAPPA arrangements in each criminal justice area, jointly overseen by what was called the responsible authority, which brought together police, probation, and prisons. In each area, there was a requirement to establish a strategic management board for those arrangements, and that was also to be supported by a MAPPA coordinator with local operational multi-agency panels in place in every area as well. The legislation also set out a wide range of what were called duties to cooperate agencies with a requirement to cooperate with these arrangements, which included DWP, NHS, local housing departments, children's services, yachts, and a range of other agencies. This is the fourth joint inspection that we have done on MAPPA over the last 20 years. The first of those in 2006, with other follow-up ones in 2011, 2015. So it was a chance to see really how MAPPA has evolved over the last 20 years and the key things that are working well and areas which may need improvement. Next slide. I think most of you probably are very well aware of how MAPPA works, but perhaps for those of you who are slightly less up to speed on those arrangements, the MAPPA legislation basically sets out three categories of offender who are eligible for MAPPA supervision. All people convicted of a sexual offence and required to register as sex offenders are automatically MAPPA nominals, and they are a big majority of the total MAPPA caseload. In addition, violence offenders sentenced to 12 months or more in custody or to a suspended sentence over 12 months also are automatically eligible across a range of specified offences, and there are nearly 23,000 of those on the current caseload. And a much smaller, but we think very important and underused category, there is an ability for lead agencies to refer to multi-agency panels high or very high serious risk of harm offenders who might benefit from multi-agency panel arrangements. Often that would be domestic abuse perpetrators who don't otherwise fit into the other two categories, but it would also cover people who've committed a sexual violent offence overseas. Recently, there has been a fourth category, a category 4 added to this list, which is terrorism or terrorism risk offenders, a category recommended by Jonathan Hall in his recent review. Those offenders were outside the scope for this current thematic, but we will be doing a joint thematic on the community management of extremist offenders early next year. So look out for that to come next year. Next slide. Once it's been established that an offender is eligible for MAPPA arrangements, then a decision has to be made at which level they should be supervised. And our thematic found that over 98% of the MAPPA caseload are being supervised at what's called level 1. And to give you the definition of level 1 in the official guidance, that's where the risks are manageable by a lead agency without the need for formal multi-agency meetings. And the guidance continues, the lead agency is confident in level 1 that their risk management plan is sufficiently robust to manage the identified risks and that there are no barriers to the implementation of agreed multi-agency actions. Where it's felt locally that actually there would be added value to risk management from supervising offenders through the formal multi-agency panel mechanism, then level 2 applies. And then for a very small number of offenders, typically very high profile offenders in which there's likely to be very high levels of media interest, there's a level 3 where more senior practitioners will be involved, senior managers from relevant agencies with the ability to leverage additional resource. Next slide. In the report, we set out recent trends in the numbers of people subject to MAPPA arrangements. And the key issue here is that there's been a growth in the overall MAPPA caseload to over 87,000, but nearly all of that growth has occurred in level 1. So there's been a 70% increase in the number of level 1 MAPPA cases over the last 10 years since 2011. You can see that trend's continued over the last 5 years. Next slide. But while MAPPA level 1 cases have significantly increased, actually the number of cases being supervised at levels 2 and 3 has actually reduced over the same period. We found that that number has halved since 2011. So one of the things the report was looking at is whether people are being supervised at the right level under the MAPPA arrangements and whether people perhaps are being moved too quickly between different levels. Next slide. Final slide for me before we get into the findings is just to briefly run you through the methodology for this study. Fieldwork was conducted from January through to March of this year. So I think we're flagging that pandemic restrictions were still in place, certainly in prisons and probation, and that will have affected the type of supervision that some people were getting. We looked at 6 police force areas, and you can see those on the map here, but particularly focusing in terms of local supervision on Cornwall, Cumbria, Leeds, Manchester South, Harrow and Barnet in London and North Wales. In addition, we looked at cases of prisoners in 6 different prisons, and again you can see those on the list here, but that included female prisons and prisons holding young offenders, Felton B, as well as adult male prisons. We looked at a total of 106 cases, which included 60 level 1 cases and over 40. Can someone turn their microphone off? We looked at 106 cases, including 60 level 1 and 42 level 2 cases. And we also looked at 48 cases that were in prison. And importantly, and this is a really important part now of all of our thematics, we wanted to know the views of people on probation about the supervision and support that they were getting. And 41 people on probation were interviewed on our behalf about their experience of MAPPA supervision. The study involved, as all of our studies do, a huge range of people we talked to, including probation practitioners, but also MAPPA chairs, Strategic Management Board chairs, representatives of the duty to cooperate agencies, victim liaison officers, heads of public protection, and a wide range of police staff and police leaders. And by crunching all of this information together, I think we've come up with some really important findings about where MAPPA is now, 20 years on from its implementation. And Noreen, we're now going to move on and you're going to tell us a bit about what we found.
Absolutely. Thanks, Justin. And thanks everybody for joining us. It's really good to see lots of people who are actually involved in the inspection joining us to hear about our findings today. So thanks for taking the time out to do that. So I'm going to start with taking you through our findings around leadership and strategy around MAPPA, and then we'll move on to talk about the findings that relate to operational delivery. So with MAPPA, we identified 2 strands of leadership, really. There's leadership at a local level and at the national level, setting the policy direction. MAPPA essentially is a set of local arrangements with a central team who are responsible for policy and guidance under the Secretary of State. And therefore, the strategic management boards in each MAPPA area are fairly autonomous and can vary their arrangements appropriately to suit local need. Each must provide certain arrangements and they must assess and manage the risks posed by MAPPA eligible offenders in their area. But necessarily geographical difference in crime patterns will mean that MAPPA areas have different profiles. The Responsible Authority National Steering Group and the National MAPPA team, alongside the MPCC lead, provide clear national leadership, steer changes and vary the guidance as developments are necessary. And we saw that as quite an active process, that central team respond when there's changes needed, such as with the development of Category 4. There's useful guidance available from the MAPPA team. The website's very accessible, and we particularly thought that the communities, discussion communities that are available through the MAPPA website were very useful and valued by people around the country. But what we did find was that the criteria for management at level 2 and 3 is interpreted very differently as we travelled around the country. This leads to a different culture amongst practitioners in relation to MAPPA, for practitioners and partner agencies, and that really impacts on how they view and the value that they place upon MAPPA. We felt that more could be done centrally to highlight these differences and support areas to understand if their interpretation has become too narrow or if they're particularly an outlier in how they're managing the criteria. When we last inspected MAPPA, we found that the performance measures were not very outcome focused, and we posed the question as to whether that was right in our last inspection. We know that there's been really careful consideration by the national team to whether better measures can be devised, and we absolutely recognise that the complexity of identifying appropriate measures, such as the success of MAPPA, what outcomes it actually achieved, can't really be isolated from other interventions and support or activity that an individual is engaged in. But we did think that, again, there could be a more quality assurance and a more comprehensive approach towards it, which could assess and identify outcomes more carefully and ensure they're considered to test the effectiveness of MAPPA. A new probation service level 1 policy framework was published in August 2021, shortly after the unification of probation services. At the time of our fieldwork, it was clear that that had not been fully implemented in all areas, and some have made a decision to delay the implementation of that policy. As we'll come to later, we have some concerns that that policy alone might not address the concerns that we have in relation to the management of level 1 cases. In terms of local leadership, the resources available to MAPPA in each area vary hugely. There's no single formula to allocate resources to MAPPA, so that leads to vast disparities in the workload that MAPPA staff have. So, for example, in Cumbria, there was one MAPPA coordinator, and in London, there was one MAPPA coordinator. And of course, the caseload under MAPPA vary hugely between those two areas. Other areas have more than one coordinator, supported by deputies and even probation officers in a MAPPA team. In some areas, the resource dedicated to MAPPA it just isn't really sufficient, and there's too heavy a reliance on operational staff who have very heavy workloads. So we particularly found that around middle managers, PDU heads who had very heavy workloads in their day job and were struggling to prepare for meetings adequately to do the MAPPA meetings justice. SMBs, we looked at the quality of information that SMBs have on which to base their decision making and set their local direction, and we found that this doesn't always sufficiently scrutinise referral rates, trends, and particularly diversity information to understand issues of disproportionality in the MAPPA population. We found some examples of very effective practice, and we saw some really effective contributions from lay advisors who'd made specific improvements to management information, and I know some of those colleagues are on the call. We also found the value of lay advisors was really important. We've included some examples of those in our effective practice guide, but some areas had struggled to recruit lay advisors and had been without their input for some time. Not all of the posts have been filled, and we hope that our effective practice guide might help with that as we've interviewed some of the lay advisors. Next slide, please. Thanks. So within the MAPPA responsible authorities of probation, prisons and policing, we considered how well MAPPA is understood within each of those organisations. Within policing, we found that those working in specialist teams, PPU teams or MOSIVO teams, managing people convicted of sexual offences were very familiar with the MAPPA process. However, others outside of those specialist teams really weren't, and that can lead to some gaps in information being shared appropriately to inform MAPPA or probation practitioners. So other strands of policing may become aware of activity from an individual and it simply wasn't being passed back because there wasn't the recognition that that was a MAPPA individual. Some forces had a practice of flagging cases which raises an alert when a MAPPA individual comes to police attention, and we felt that was particularly impressive, but it was not in every police force. And similarly, in prisons, we found that offender management units have good MAPPA awareness, but this didn't always extend to wing staff or other departments who were less aware of what information should be passed back to the OMU and then to be fed into MAPPA meetings. We heard from a variety of staff in all agencies that they didn't always feel fully equipped for their roles in MAPPA. That was particularly staff who were working in approved premises or victim liaison officers who have a really important contribution to make to MAPPA meetings, but in some cases just didn't feel empowered or equipped to join in the meetings and present information as they needed to. In 2015, we found that there was a gap in the management of level 2 individuals in category 2 and 3 who weren't always allocated to a police offender manager. So if someone's convicted of sexual offence, they generally have a police offender manager, but for violent offences, there wasn't always a police owner. And again, that led to some a lack of ownership, really, which created some problems in communication and management of those individuals. And I think we saw that was still the case in this inspection. The structure and processes for MAPPA made a huge difference to the culture that's created around MAPPA work. We heard from practitioners in all agencies that where MAPPA is perceived as overly bureaucratic or cumbersome, practitioners will avoid referring. So lengthy referral forms, and we know there's been some work done around addressing that concern more recently, but it really put people off. And likewise, where there was a screening process that's perceived as remote and not part of a practitioner's everyday experience, they feel that they don't have a part in it, and again, it deters them from referring. Conversely, where practitioners have a clear understanding of the processes and they understand the criteria, they feel much more positive about MAPPA and it becomes embedded in their working practice. The majority of referrals come from probation practitioners, so therefore creating the right culture is absolutely key. Next slide, please. So moving on to what we actually found around the delivery of MAPPA, so starting with delivery at level 1. This was the first time we'd looked at level 1 as part of a thematic inspection. In the previous inspections, we just looked at the management of level 2 and 3 cases. So this time we were very interested to understand what it means to be a level 1 case. As we've said, there's over 98% of the cases currently who are managed at level 1. And how they're managed and reviewed is integral to the whole MAPPA process. But too often it's seen as a separate part of the process and not actually linked to MAPPA business. Many MAPPA cases will have served time in prison. Our prison inspection work highlighted problems with assessments being completed sufficiently early to inform the MAPPA level setting that we applied on release. We found a disconnect between the ROTL processes and MAPPA too. They don't align, so often prisoners will be having ROTLs prior to a MAPPA level being determined, and that can lead to some differences in restrictions on release from what they've had when they've been released on ROTLs. At 2 prisons we visited, there were a total of 58 MAPPA prisoners who had regular ROTLs, and 46 of those did not have a confirmed management level. The restrictions, as we said, can be greater than on release than on the temporary release, which causes confusion for prisoners perhaps. Out of the 48 prison cases we reviewed, 3 prisoners had no OASIS at all, and assessments for around 1/3 of the prisoners in the sample were over a year old, which we didn't feel was appropriate or led to a sufficiently informed and relevant up-to-date assessment. In our community work, of the 60 cases at level 1 that we looked at, only 23, so that's 41%, had had a review of that MAPPA level. Half had no MAPPA Q, which should set out the rationale for the level, or other rationale recorded. We weren't looking just for the MAPPA Q, we were looking for other rationale, and it wasn't there in half of the cases that we looked at. We were concerned in some areas that level setting had been done by administrative staff, which gave practitioners a false sense of confidence that a practice decision based on risk and need had been made before the case was allocated. So they didn't then revisit that decision to check that it was the right decision. In some areas, we found that level 1 really had little meaning. We found that level 1 status had only enhanced the management of risk of serious harm and public protection in 32% of the level 1 cases we inspected. We had some concerns that the policy framework introduced in August of last year may not address that. Particularly around the communication and multi-agency working that we identified a need to improve. One practitioner, as you can see the quote there on the top of that slide, typified what we heard from many people, and they said, "I tend to forget their MAPPA, less emphasis is given to these cases." There were notable exceptions. North Wales, for example, had a really long established review process for level 1 cases, which ensured robust scrutiny of the MAPPA level and ensured that information from other agencies was taken into account when reviewing MAPPA levels, including the victim liaison officer, which we thought was really important. The MAPPA coordinator in that area takes a strong interest in level 1 cases and absolutely sees that as part of her work, which is quite a stark contrast to what we found in other areas. In North Wales, we found that the quality of case management from a probation perspective was consistent across all 3 MAPPA levels, which again was very different from what we found in other areas. We've highlighted quite a few aspects of their work in our effective practice guide. So pre-release planning for level 1 cases we found to be less thorough than for level 2 and 3 cases. Too often the community offender manager didn't always seek information from the probation offender manager. 14 of the 29 cases who were within 6 months of release that we looked at didn't have a confirmed MAPPA level. And in prisons we found that the interdepartmental information sharing was very inconsistent too, and still some examples of offender management units struggling to get security information, for example. We found that assessments for level 1 cases generally in the community and in prison had a good focus on the factors linked to offending, risk of harm, desistance, and engage the person on probation in most cases. So that's the assessment started out on the right track, but too often we found that sufficient domestic abuse checks hadn't been undertaken, and in almost 1/3 of the cases where it was required, we felt there was a need for it to be done, there hadn't been sufficient child safeguarding information shared. Our case inspections found that the victim needs in level 1 were less well considered than they were in cases at level 2 and 3. And in most areas, victim liaison officers told us that they weren't aware of level 1 reviews taking place and they weren't routinely asked for information, with the exception of North Wales, as I've mentioned. Planning at level 1 was weaker than at level 2. The contact arranged during an order or licence we found was only sufficient to support the risk management plan in 53% of the cases we looked at. Reviewing focused sufficiently on risk of serious harm in just under half of the cases that we inspected, and overall we found that the MAPPA status enhanced the management of level 1 cases in only 32% of cases, as I've mentioned. In our prison sample, we found that the value of level 1 status was really only present in 3 out of 24 cases. We found that 13% or 22% of our level 1 sample should have been managed at a higher level. It was clear in some cases that the length and complexity of referral forms was a barrier to practitioners referring cases to level 2 and 3, even if they thought that it might be necessary. In some areas, this was compounded by a lack of confidence in what would be achieved from doing so. So there was a sense that taking a case to level 2 would still result in all the actions coming back to the probation practitioners. They didn't see a value in going for that multi-agency discussion. To refer a case to level 2 or 3, the question of what the added value is asked, and we found that the interpretation of what added value is varied very widely, with some areas interpreting that this must be the additional need for another agency or a resource that wasn't already involved or available. So this prevents individuals being adopted to level 2 and 3 on the basis of complexity, or where the added value would simply be the scrutiny and oversight that MAPPA brings with the multi-agency partners around the table. In some areas, the narrow interpretations create quite a negative culture around MAPPA and a lack of practitioner confidence in the process and the value. In the more positive areas, we saw staff were positive about MAPPA. They welcomed the support they gained with complex cases and welcomed the input from other agencies when they had cases at level 2 or 3. We found that police rarely escalate cases to level 2 or 3. Some felt that it was really only for probation-led cases that they didn't feel police-led cases had a place at level 2 or 3. There was a lack of understanding as well in some areas about how MAPPA fits with other forums such as IOM, and I think there's been some fairly useful guidance circulated more recently. But we found that where an individual had been managed by IOM, it had been identified that wasn't sufficient to manage the risks, they were rarely then reconsidered for MAPPA at that stage. We did find that the current document set, as I've mentioned, could be a barrier to referrals due to the work involved in actually completing the paperwork, but we know that there's been some work done on that more recently. Next slide, please. So looking then at the delivery of MAPPA around level 2 and 3 cases, in general, we found that level 2 and 3 cases were better managed, but there was still room for improvement. But there was a real value to cases being referred to level 2 or 3. In all of the level 3 cases and 73% of the level 2 cases, we felt that MAPPA had enhanced the management of risk of serious harm and public protection, so it had made a difference. Examples where we felt that hadn't been the case were those where the case had been escalated to level 2 for a reason that had not then and the outcome that was intended had not been achieved. So, for example, to obtain accommodation, and that wasn't achieved, and the case was reduced to level 1, perhaps shouldn't have gone to level 2 in the first place. Or where the case was reduced too quickly with important actions outstanding, which were then not subsequently completed. And we've given some examples of those in the report. Despite finding an initial solid focus on the factors linked to risk of harm in level 2 and 3 cases, there were some obvious omissions from risk management plans in 23% of the level 2 cases we reviewed. So examples of this were a failure to consider all of the potential victims who may be at risk from the individual, or too narrow a focus on the index offence, not taking into account other risks or previous behaviours that exist. In 9 of our sample cases, the MAPPA level had been reduced too quickly, we felt, with rationales that we didn't agree with. So, for example, there was in one case that there were outstanding actions related to child safeguarding that hadn't been attended to, and the case had been reduced to level 1 without those matters being concluded. In terms of the delivery of MAPPA and panel meetings, we felt that having a standing MAPPA panel provided detailed and specialist advice which could support case progression. We felt there was a real value in having attendees who could represent their agencies and, where needed, support staff directly involved in the case, who may rarely come to be involved in MAPPA, so particularly those involved with mental health perhaps or health. They acted as a single point of contact for their service and were a really useful route to escalate issues to strategic management boards where necessary, as often the same person attended both levels of meeting. We found generally very good levels of engagement from duty to cooperate agencies. We came across gaps, and where we did see gaps, that was often children's social care services or adult social care services, health colleagues and housing authorities not always attending meetings where they were expected to attend. The 4 pillars approach we considered, it was initially optional. Not all MAPPA areas adopted the 4 pillars approach to meetings, but more recently it's become embedded in the national model, and we found that where it was used fully, it really does focus attention on risk management but not all areas have fully embraced the approach. So some were saying that they were using the 4 pillars approach, but it was more a kind of checklist approach at the end of a meeting rather than it being at the heart of their structure. As Justin has already mentioned, we found category 3 was somewhat underused. Not all practitioners were aware of category 3 as a pathway for cases, particularly in relation to domestic abuse, where formal multi-agency meetings we felt could add real value. So we followed this work from work that HMICFRS did in their violence against women and girls inspection last year, where they identified that of 40 high harm domestic abuse perpetrators that were identified, only 3 were being managed under MAPPA, and only a small amount of the additional 37 were managed under any form of multi-agency arrangements. So we sampled about 20 cases from each probation delivery unit where there was a known domestic abuse concern and the individual was assessed as posing a high or very high risk of serious harm. We looked at the risk management plan in each of those cases, and we were looking to see whether MAPPA had been considered. Absolutely appreciate not all of those cases will need to go to MAPPA or should go to MAPPA, but we wanted to see whether it had been considered as an option. We found some were marked as not MAPPA eligible, which we felt was unhelpful practice. More appropriately, the case is not automatically MAPPA eligible, but of course category 3 could still be used. We felt that blinkered the practitioners' potential to consider using category 3. Almost a third of the level 2 cases we inspected, it was unclear as to whether the person on probation, the person under MAPPA, was aware about their MAPPA status, and Sarah will talk about that later on in the presentation about their work. Next slide, please. So, looking at the systems that support MAPPA, VISA is the national database that holds information on offenders with sexual offender registration or violent, potentially dangerous persons. VISA has been around for quite a long time. We found in our last inspection that prison and probation were not using VISA as a shared tool, and where they didn't use the system, the quality of information provided was rarely of a high standard. Disappointingly, we haven't found that much has changed since we last inspected. The recommendations we made in the last inspection haven't been achieved. VISA was being used actively as an information sharing tool in only 38% of the cases we inspected. As previously, we found that the police use the VISA as well established and relevant risk information from a range of systems being added, but probation and prison colleagues weren't accessing this information. Of 67 probation practitioners we interviewed, none told us that they access VISA directly. 11 said they have access via an administrator, and 4 said they had access but didn't use the system. 78% told us they didn't use VISA at all. So it's not an embedded part of probation practice, and many practitioners told us they didn't really know what value it would add by using it. Under the current guidance, not all MAPPA cases are required to be added to VISA, and this means that there's no one single place where information can be uploaded on those individuals. So moving on to think about systems that support prison management of MAPPA cases, there have been an extremely complicated picture around alerts on the NOMIS system for MAPPA cases, and we know there's some ongoing work to improve that, and I think we saw some improvement in the simplification of that process, but that was still a challenge for senior managers to know exactly who was a MAPPA case and who wasn't. We considered, our prison colleagues considered public protection measures, and we wanted to highlight issues around monitoring of prisoners. So there's the case study provided there. we found that when done well, a critical part of monitoring prisoners was monitoring of telephone calls, and our colleagues in HMI prisons saw many places with a huge backlog of calls waiting to be listened to, and prisons being simply overwhelmed with large numbers of prisoners who needed their calls monitoring. They don't have the right systems in place or staff in many cases to do this. Even in some places where the process is taking place, the quality of monitoring was often fairly poor, and being done by inconsistent members of staff. So, for example, OSGs on nights that were given as an example, staff who don't really understand the context of risk management, so they're not necessarily tuned into what they should be listening out for. We did find some good practice and good examples. So we found decisions being made to escalate cases from level 1 to level 2 because information had been obtained during monitoring of calls. In Newhall, we found that monitoring was timely and recordings were of good quality, and information was shared appropriately from what was obtained. And the case study that you can see there on the screen gives an example of just how crucial some of the information obtained can be. I'm probably running vastly out of time, so I'll move us on to our recommendations. So we've made a total of 13 recommendations, which in summary call for improved quality assurance and audit activity, with support from the central team to analyse this work so that we can consider the consistency of MAPPA delivery. We've called for a review of resources available to MAPPA work to try and again iron out some inconsistency in the resources allocated. Improvements in the quality of management of level 1 cases. We've again recommended that all MAPPA cases have a record in a shared database, VISA currently, and we know VISA is due to be replaced at some point, so that information can be accessed and updated by prisons, probation and police in a meaningful way and ensure there's appropriate sharing of risk information. And we've recommended that all staff involved in MAPPA delivery, not just those responsible for directly managing the cases, but all those that have a role, are properly equipped through training for their roles. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sarah Lewis, who will talk you through the findings from PRS's work on this. Sarah.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here and good afternoon to you all. My name is Dr. Sarah Lewis and I am the Director of Penal Reform Solutions, an organisation that specialises in co-production, desistance-focused practice and cultural change in criminal justice organisations. And our project was led by a team of lived experience consultants, and we very much focused on interviewing those that were on probation subject to MAPPA. So next slide, please. So in terms of our participants, we interviewed 41 participants in total and also invited them to take part in a creative project to increase engagement, where they summarised their experiences in 5 words and attached an image to that. In the 41 interviews, 35 were men and 6 were women. A majority of were white British, and but there was a range of ethnicity across our remaining sample. And what we were really looking at was firstly, how do people understand the MAPPA process, how they experience it, and what impact it has on their lives, including their rehabilitation. I've just got up there just to kind of highlight maybe one of our most surprising findings, just in terms of the initial contact with our participants, was that 58.62% of our participants found out they were actually on MAPPA from engaging with us in the research. Again, that was quite a surprise for them, and certainly quite a surprise for us. Next slide, please. So in terms of our key themes, firstly, we identified the need for greater communication. So participants talked about feeling in the dark, and this led to a real sense of feeling quite unsettled, not understanding what the MAPPA process was and not being communicated or notified that they were on MAPPA and what that meant for them in their lives. They also very much talked about the MAPPA process being done to them, rather than being done with them, and that was something that led to anxiety and I guess uncertainty around what was happening in their lives. Support was another theme. So people on subject to MAPPA felt that the process was in some senses working against them. They didn't feel that it supported their rehabilitation, and in some senses that support was kind of counterproductive for them in terms of moving away from crime. Some also talked about it not being tailored to meet their needs, whether that was around neurodiversity or their individual needs. And this in some senses led to an increase of resentment, not only for those that they were working with, but for the system more broadly. However, there was a significant amount of people that really talked about how supportive MAPPA was as a process and the people that were contained within it. So participants talked about the kind of proactive approach and how they really valued the support that they got. Next slide, please. Another theme that we talked about was that of greater control. So having control and empowerment. Firstly, those that felt that they were being controlled, in some senses, kind of described to us an erosion of trust, not only for the process, but again projecting that out for the criminal justice system largely. There was certainly a feeling that there was a lack of control in decisions about their lives, and the lack of involvement, the closed meetings, led to people feeling in some senses excluded and out of control in terms of that process. And this again links very closely with that sense of meaning. So a theme that came from our findings was that on the one side, those that didn't know about MAPPA, those that weren't aware of it, in some senses didn't have any meaning attached to it. There was certainly a negative impact in terms of people associating MAPPA to, very much people that are monsters, as quoted by number of our participants, and that real stigma that was attached to it. So, it meant something to them, but something that was certainly quite negative for them in terms of, I guess, those labels. On the other hand, we then had those people that were very highly supported by that process, talking about, I'm going places now, before I had no real future. Another participant saying life now has meaning to me. So some real profound meaning was certainly achieved for those individuals that saw the MAPPA process as legitimate and engaged very fully within it. And this seemed to be very largely dependent on the relationships they had with their probation officer, particularly if they were caring and understanding. Next slide, please. Just before we go on to suggestions, there's just one final theme, which I guess moves across all of the themes, was that of relationships. So in terms of those that really found MAPPA helpful, talked an awful lot about the relationships that they had with people. And this was specifically linked and highlighted more prevalently with probation officers. Those that felt that there was a stigma attached to it, in some senses distanced themselves from the criminal justice system at large, as well as the services that were trying to support them or, I guess, monitor them through the MAPPA process. In terms of our suggestions, firstly, there's something about raising awareness, not only raising awareness for the person that's on probation or in prison, but also raising awareness to the public in terms of what MAPPA entails and what's going on and the valuable work that is taking place, particularly in terms of effective practice. Also greater awareness for those that are maybe touched a little bit by MAPPA, so whether that's landlords or employers or partners or family members, so that they really understand the process that is taking place, as it remained quite hidden behind closed doors for those that we interviewed. We also recommend that there's kind of greater communication between agencies, a consistent theme that takes place, generally when multidisciplinary work is carried out, and very much having much clearer and accessible information that is responsive to the literacy needs and the neurodiversity needs of those that are subject to probation. There's also something there about notifying people, the need to notify them, and I guess to ease their minds or to explain the process, but also to verify that understanding of what they then understand MAPPA to be, and how it works and what role they play within that, I guess. We also recommend that involving people in MAPPA in terms of the real kind of drive around, whether that's co-production or service user engagement, very much increasing the involvement that people on MAPPA have. Not only to, I guess, inform and evaluate the process, but also to be involved in their own MAPPA process in order to enhance responsibility and promote inclusion, and also to empower people, I guess, to give people that voice. And then finally, I guess that focus on relationships. So really looking at how we can build those really positive relationships on a kind of micro level, so that you gain that legitimacy and that trust, so that these processes that kind of overlay the system are seen as legitimate and trusted by those that are on probation, and doing that in a procedurally just way. So doing that with neutrality, fairness, and an explanation, I guess, explaining decisions in a variety of ways so that people understand what's going on for them in terms of their experience. That's pretty much it from me. If you want to see our report, we've also got our creative project and our podcast. So the podcast is the consultants were interviewed to talk about their experiences as being lived experience consultants on the project and the key findings from the report, just to create a more accessible version. If you want to get in touch, obviously there's our email, and the report is available in our publication section of our website. And now I'm going to pass over to Tammie, who's going to talk about effective practice.
Thanks, Sarah. Really powerful stuff, and just shows the importance of getting it right, I think. Okay, brilliant. So as Noreen referred to earlier, from the field work, we were able to collect a number of examples of where we saw our standards delivered well, which is our definition of effective practice. And there are quite a few examples. So we've designed the guide so that you can dip in and out of it using the contents page and the various subheadings. So the structure is as shown here. There's an introduction, which is just a really brief overview of the aim of the guide. Then in the background section, we cover the legislative framework, duty to cooperate, agencies, MAPPA categories and levels. Then the standards section, we identify what we look for and our expectations. We then provide an overview of the learning that Sarah's just shared. And then the next two sections go into the effective practice examples. So in the first one, we look at our domain 1, which is organisational delivery, and then we look at case supervision. We then conclude with some sort of overall key learning points and offer a few additional resources. So if we can go on to the next slide. This is just a few of the key takeaways from leadership, strategy and policy. But to just go through the examples that we actually share that illustrate these key takeaways, we share an example from Cumbria of the Strategic Management Board. I keep wanting to say senior, but it's strategic. And inspectors noticed that the vision and strategy of the SMT had really endured through changes in personnel, and they referred it to it as the engine room being really well tuned. So we found that there was a real focus on developing MAPPA, not only with the national arrangements, but also to be really responsive to the needs of Cumbria. They made good use of data and information, and there was a real focus on improving services. Examples of that being sharing the learning across areas, especially with their neighbouring Lancashire, using a small MAPPA executive group, and adjusting the 4 pillars structure so that the victim safety pillar came higher on the agenda. And we share a video of Noreen interviewing the previous and current chairs, which is Dan and Lisa, who I think I've spotted somewhere in the audience. And they talk about how they've achieved that. And I think one of the brilliant quotes from that is, it might be different people steering the boat, but the actual people in the engine room are there continuously. They're dedicated and they deeply care about the MAPPA stuff. We then spoke to a couple of lay advisors from Cumbria who were a really integral part of the MAPPA structure there. They both recorded interviews for us and they share their insight into their roles, how they fit into the Cumbria structure, the leadership and the impact of the role they had. Both we interviewed separately and they both spoke about the importance of representing the voice of the residents of Cumbria and being that critical friend to drive a continuous improvement. And what I found really interesting is, even though we interviewed everyone separately, they all used language that kind of mirrored each other, which to me suggested that they were really bought into that vision. So next we go to North Wales, and I think I've spotted the PDU head Andy from North Wales here. And we spotted a really well-defined vision and strategy with a strong focus on multi-agency work, and that was no doubt aided by the co-location of probation and police. So Noreen interviews the head of PDU and MAPPA coordinator to find out more about the processes and the culture and how it's been developed. And I think one of the things I remember them saying is they made sure that MAPPA felt relevant and helpful in risk management for everyone on operational level. I think it's also really interesting to note that, as Noreen referred to earlier, the MAPPA coordinator was involved in MAPPA processes for all levels in North Wales. So the quote from her was that she said that she felt like she'd got it all in a basket. She said she tries to have an oversight of all of those cases, whether they be level 1, 2 or 3. They also talk about their approach to life as an IPPs, but I don't want to spoil you reading the report, so I won't go into that. In relation to staffing, again, North Wales, we learned about a case administrator role called a CASPO, who specifically supports the SPO role, and they support with a range of tasks from leave requests to transferring management oversight entries from supervision notes to DDS. Specifically in relation to MAPPA, they track level 1 reviews, they contact the victim liaison officers, so victims' views are considered in the process, and just kind of make sure that that happens. And one of the SPOs in that area spoke to us about that role, who I think is also on this, so thank you, Marina, for that. And finally, in this section, we look at information, and again in North Wales, we noted the police used Visor for all MAPPA cases, and that included level 1 category 2. And what that meant was that intelligence relating to those individuals was effectively shared and managed jointly across both police and probation. Moving on to the next session about case supervision with the next slide, please. We found that if effective MAPPA work to keep people safe requires these key points, and we were able to find a good range of examples of this being done. So the examples we've included in the guide cover a range of themes. So we've covered meaningfully involving the person on probation, a real focus on protective integration, and what we mean by that is it's a phrase coined by Professor Hazel Kemshall, where she talks about blending desistance with safety. So if you want to read more about that, you can pop on our website and the research page and look at the Academics Insights papers by Hazel Kemshall. We also found some good examples of professional curiosity, both in assessment and delivery, effective use of co-working in a really challenging MAPPA case, some good multi-agency work, both at a level 1 and a level 2, early identification of MAPPA, effective use of category 3, reducing MAPPA levels, having the professional courage to appropriately challenge other professionals, comprehensive release work, transfer of MAPPAs and clear recording. Oh, I can breathe now. So I think I've got time just to share a couple of quick examples just to kind of whet your appetite. So Noreen and Justin spoke earlier about the response to level 1 cases. I just want to share the power of a well-managed level 1 case. So the person on probation, who we've called Daniel, he was recalled for failing to disclose a relationship whilst on licence for a sexual offence. Throughout the recall period, the practitioner maintained a good level of communication with him. There was evidence of liaison with the police, social care and prison and the victims unit throughout that time. The agencies worked together with Daniel to devise a robust release plan, and that included disclosures, residence and approved premise and a tracking device. The practitioner ensured that Daniel was really part of that release planning and fully understood what was expected of him. And given that robust risk management in place, he was managed at a MAPPA level 1, but equally the plan identified what triggers would necessitate a referral to an increased MAPPA level. Upon his release, there was regular ongoing communication between all of agencies, and his progress was discussed in supervision with the SPO, alongside consultation with the victims liaison officer. And I think finally, just the last example I'd like to share is we've heard how beneficial MAPPA can be, and I think it's really important to consider cases that meet the criteria and not overlook those category 3 referrals. So those are for those ones who don't meet category 1 or 2, but the offence indicates the person is capable of causing serious harm and requires that 2 or 3 management. On the field work, there was an excellent example of someone who'd received a custodial sentence for controlling or coercive behaviour against his mum, and that had involved a weapon. The pre-sentence report author had requested a psychological report, did an addendum, and that highlighted a whole range of needs and a history of poor compliance. So as a result, he was referred to a MAPPA level 2. And there was evidence that that enabled the in-reach mental health team to access information that was quite tricky for them to get. And it also meant a really swift multi-agency response on his release when risk factors increase. So they're just a couple of examples, but there's loads more in the report. So I would encourage you to go and have a nose. And that is me. So I shall be handing back over to Justin now. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tammie, and do make sure you have a read of Tammie's report and also of Noreen's report and Sarah's excellent report too. And I've put links to all three of those in the chat line. We are staying on for questions. We don't have to stop at 12:30 for questions. If people want to stay on with us, all of the speakers will stay on. Do either put your questions in the chat line or raise your yellow hand. Would be delighted to hear from you. Keen to hear from colleagues who were involved in the fieldwork as well. And Noreen and Tammie mentioned that we know there's colleagues from North Wales, Cumbria, Manchester, London, and various other fieldwork areas as well. So it would be great to get your experiences too. So there's a question from Viv. You mentioned in relation to, I think, D3, domestic abuse high-risk offenders, some statistics around MARAC data. Would you think that? Do you think that domestic abuse high harm offenders are underrepresented at MAPPA, and would it be useful to have lay advisors specialising in domestic abuse to be present when dealing with these cases, or as a specialised domestic abuse agency be included as duty to operate agencies and guidance for these cases as part of best practice? What do you think, Noreen?
Well, I'm going to slightly fudge the answer to this, I think. So I think the role of the lay advisors is really about being a critical friend to the Strategic Management Board and looking at the processes. So I'm not sure about the specialist knowledge, but for those with an interest in domestic abuse, we are about to deliver a thematic inspection of domestic probation, domestic abuse practice. Certainly the relationship between MARAC, MAPPA will be considered as part of that inspection. So I think if I can answer that question in about 12 months' time, I will be much more informed to do so, having looked much more closely at the MARAC processes as well. That probably doesn't answer the question satisfactorily, but it's probably the best I can do for now.
Thanks, Noreen. We've got a couple of people put their hands up. Tom, you put your hand down again, but Nicholas Moss.
Yeah, thank you. I put my camera and I've unmuted myself. Nicholas Moss, a relatively new lay advisor for Hertfordshire. I note I'm looking at page 26 of the report, and I note, and in the context of the observations I think Noreen particularly and others have made about the value of lay advisors, and the difficulty at paragraph 2.5 of, in some areas, finding recruits. And I know in one area in our locality that's an issue. And I wonder whether any thought has been given to suggesting that lay advisors receive a payment. The legislation actually allows for that. With all due respect, I think that the wording of 2.5 isn't entirely consistent with what section 325 of the CJA actually says. And I just wonder if any thought has been given to recommending that a small payment be made to lay advisors, given the value attached to them. People don't do it for the money. Nevertheless, recognition of someone's contribution to this area of activity, which is incredibly important, may be an area which ministers might want to contemplate exercising their powers under 325 to make a small payment. Any thoughts on that, please?
Noreen, did this come up, recruitment, did it come up as an issue in a lot of the fieldwork areas?
326, not 325, beg your pardon.
Sorry. Thank you for your question. I think we certainly heard some challenges about expenses, perhaps, and people. I think we were given some examples of people who wanted to engage as lay advisors, but were struggling with internet connections and struggling to get that kind of funded. Payment didn't come up from what we heard. Payment wasn't an issue that was raised as to why areas were struggling to find lay advisors. It was really about finding the right places to advertise it locally, and then the process by which lay advisors are appointed being quite a cumbersome one and having to be approved at a ministerial level. So I'm not sure whether it would be for us to recommend whether payment should be made, but I think perhaps promoting the role of lay advisors in local communities and within groups of people that may be interested. What we were told was, unless you're regularly looking at the public appointments website, you may miss these opportunities. And certainly, I'm not sure if we've got Mark and David on the call that we spoke to in Cumbria, but how they had come across the role we cover in our interviews in the Effective Practice Guide. We hope that those interviews with them might be used as a tool that people can use to encourage recruitment. So hopefully that's of use.
Thanks, Noreen.
I won't have to respond again, but
Sorry, Nicola.
No, as I said, I won't take up your time now with a follow-on from that. Perhaps we'll have a conversation offline, but thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you, Nicholas. Question from Tom Rogers in relation to PSS. PSS raises significant challenges for the management of violent offenders in particular, as by definition the risk management plan is reduced significantly during this PSS period, which loses you key conditions, etc. Was PSS raised as a challenge for Category 2 MAPPA cohort? Noreen.
I can absolutely understand the challenge it poses. I don't think we had any cases who were at level 2 and on PSS. So no, in our field work, it didn't arise specifically from memory, but absolutely understands the concern that on PSS people have less powers than they would, for example, on licence. So no, we didn't cover it specifically.
Lisa Thornton. Lisa, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Justin. My name's Lisa Thornton. I'm from Cumbria PDU, so we were one of the inspected areas. I'm really pleased that some of the efforts that we make around MAPPA have been recognised as well in the report, and I think it really reassuring from my perspective to see that there are aspects of good practice that are being delivered right across the country. I'm struggling with my camera this morning. It looks like it's on for me, but if it's not, my apologies. I think it's really reassuring, especially at the moment as things are as challenging as they are out in probation world, that we have seen areas that have been able to deliver good practice and work in accordance with what we want to achieve by MAPPA. So I'm really pleased that that good practice nationally has been recognised, and Tammie, I think you've done a great job with that as well. I think it's a fabulous piece of work, and it will be absolutely help, I think, in how we take forward achieving some of those improvements. There was a question I did have though for Noreen and Justin probably is what are your plans in terms of coming back to see how well we've been able to deliver some of those recommended improvements?
Well, what happens next, Lisa, is that there is a requirement on government to come back to us with an action plan in relation to our recommendations, and we'll look forward to receiving that in the next few months. And we then expect a sort of 1 year on report on how they've got on in relation to that action plan. The other mechanism that we have is our local core inspections of probation and obviously of police and prisons on the other side. And we do ask about MAPPA arrangements when we are going into local PDUs. I remember Noreen sitting in on the discussion you had in Warwickshire recently, didn't you, with the MAPPA team? So it's something that we interview relevant staff locally in all of our core inspections and comment on what we find. So we have various ways we can follow things up, and it's such a key cohort of people to be keeping an eye on, and we have got such ongoing concerns around risk management that I think this is something we will continue to focus very, very closely on. Catherine Cheshire, I think you may have missed at the beginning. You asked about consideration of input from YOS staff and children subject to MAPPA. For this particular thematic, we were focused on adult offenders subject to MAPPA, and so we're just looking at probation. But I don't know, Noreen, did you pick up anything more generally about YOS participation in MAPPA panels or any commentary around that?
No, I mean, obviously, when we were talking about duties to cooperate agencies, we found that youth offending services were mentioned as part of that, but we weren't looking at any individuals that would apply to. But we certainly found that youth offending services were present and part of strategic management boards as needed. Although sometimes a representative from a local authority would be trying to span children's services and the youth offending services, so those kind of two specialisms within that. And I think some of the SMBs told us that wasn't always appropriate because they didn't have the right specialist knowledge, but we didn't look at cases that came from the youth world.
Excellent. There's a few comments about the not MAPPA eligible flag on the systems, and you were saying that's not a particularly helpful flag sometimes.
Yeah, so it was
any suggestion it could be taken off.
This was a manual line that had been added to risk management plans, so it had been typed in by someone, and I think it was it's to identify, I can understand it's to identify those who are not automatically MAPPA eligible, but our finding was that it blinkered people from thinking about pathways into category 3. So it's not a flag as in a registration from a drop-down list. People have typed it into a risk management plan, and then what we found is perhaps when the case moves to another person, the thinking is, oh, this case isn't MAPPA eligible, so that's out of my kind of toolbox now, whereas it's not an accurate thing to say, and if the need is there, they could still be referred in. So I think it was possibly a practice habit maybe that existed in the past.
Thanks. Tom, did you want to come in on this point? Tom Rogers.
Yeah, please. Yeah, so my understanding is that if we've got a Cat 2 MAPPA eligible offender, they'll obviously be flagged as MAPPA throughout their sentence, but then when they're still under live probation management under PSS, staff have to use the not MAPPA eligible flag, or it'll appear as though it's still a MAPPA case, and so it'll look like it's flagged incorrectly if there isn't a MAPPA flag. So
yeah,
it's counter to that whole idea, isn't it, of MAPPA level 2 referral being fluid and flexible, and we need to avoid this idea where they hit the end of their sentence and they fall off a cliff. They're therefore not MAPPA eligible, and it is a flag. They are flagged or registered as not MAPPA eligible, and that counters what we're trying to achieve, doesn't it, around sensible consideration of Cat 3 for all of these type of complex cases, particularly as we're losing all those conditions all in one go.
Yeah.
So.
Tom, it's a really good point, and I think there's two strands to that. So what we were looking at is that being put into a risk management plan, but you're talking, of course, about the DELIUS registration, which is a different thing, but equally as relevant. Yeah, absolutely. There is there's an example either in the report or the effective practice guide that considers just exactly the point that you've raised, which is the kind of MAPPA planning for a case that's coming to the end of statutory supervision, and about appropriate contingency arrangements being put in place for an individual who's quite dangerous and will be coming to the end of probation supervision, and a kind of plea for MAPPA to be considering that, rather than the focus in this particular case had all been on if he gets released before the end of his sentence, how are we going to manage, but more importantly, what happens if he doesn't, in that case. So it's the end of supervision is of course really important to consider too in the multi-agency arrangements. Thanks, Tom.
Just to add there that Louise has put a note in the chat saying that they will review the flags.
That's great. Thanks, Louise, for that. That's a great bit of feedback already. Mel Bowden, you were part of the HMIC FRS team that helped with this inspection. Many thanks for that. Any particular views on the police aspects of what you found?
I think it was certainly a mixed picture, with the the positive is the good use advisor, etc. And I'm just looking at Amy's chat about that read across with MAPPA and MARAC, which would be really, really beneficial, because we saw, and again the Borg statistics pick this up as well. Excuse me, I've got a cold. That MARAC. Cases managed under MARAC weren't always considered for MAPPA, and certainly there was a missed opportunity there. So, but yeah.
Couple of issues I discussed with you, Mel, on Wednesday was firstly the workloads of some of the Mossova staff, very high in some areas, which meant that they sometimes they've been forced into sort of reactive mode rather than more active monitoring of registered sex offenders. And then the second issue was about the differential between pretty organised way of monitoring sex offenders, but perhaps a bit patchier in relation to the category 2 violent offenders, because responsibility for those could be spread across a range of teams, including IOM and serious organised crime and others.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for workloads in some areas were really high, to the point of being excessive. And also we know that the number of RSOs is increasing. So, and also, many of the teams are doing proactive work as well. So they were, looking at doing warrants, looking at doing, proactive work to actively monitor offenders, which is again adding to that workload as well. So, it's a difficult one because it is continuing to rise. So some forces were pushed into the difficult decision of how they were going to prioritise the management of offenders. In relation to violent offenders, we found that in the areas, and every force we went to had a MOSAVO unit or a sexual offender management unit, and the management of RSOs was particularly good. You know, that because staff were trained, offender managers were trained, but as for violence, there was a real mixed picture about where those violent offenders were managed. So usually it was outside of the sexual offender management unit, which meant there was some officers or offender managers weren't MOSAVO trained, but it also meant there was that lack of awareness as well of what MAPPA and that process could offer. So, which is why, you know, we've obviously raised that through the report.
Yeah. Thanks, Mel. I can't see any more questions or any more hands. Any final questions, people? Nicholas, is that an old hand from your previous question?
It's what they call a legacy hand, isn't it?
A legacy.
Love the term.
Phrases we've come to know during the pandemic. Yeah. Gareth, you put your hand up.
Thanks. Just picking up on that partnership for violent offenders. You know, we're hoping to be working with the police over the coming few months as we get better at using Visor in probation. Well, we obviously need that information to do proper risk assessments and risk management plans. There's an interim agreement in place, but we're hoping to come back year on year to build on it. But because of the delays with the Visor project, we haven't been in a position to do that. But as and when we get up to speed with Visor, we will certainly be turning to the police for intelligence and information about the CAT tools.
Thanks for that, Gareth. Any other questions or observations? Okay, I think we'll probably wrap it up now. Thank you ever so much to everyone who's joined us today. Many thanks to our speakers, to Noreen and to Sarah and to Tammie. Thanks to Mel and colleagues from the Prisons Inspectorate who helped out with this. Many thanks to everyone of you in the fieldwork area who helped with our fieldwork. And special thanks to Kevin and Lynn and Shona for their help with logistics around today's events. I hope you've enjoyed it. As Kevin said at the beginning of the session, there will be a video, a recording of this session. We'll put it up on our YouTube channel reasonably soon, and I circulated the links to the reports themselves, so do read the full reports. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy your weekends.